Welcome to Everyday Torah. My name is Trevor. I've got Gary with me. If you're a part of the Melchizedek series and you've been trekking through, you know Gary quite well already. And if you're brand new to the channel, just let me say welcome. And this channel is dedicated to Yeshua, Jesus, and walking in his ways, the Torah. And Gary, last time we were talking about Melchizedek as bringer of righteousness and justice.
Yes,
Yeah.
that's right. Yes.
And
yes.
Today we're transitioning into the priest part. And
Yeah.
yeah, make sure you define that for us too.
Yeah.
I'm excited about everything, but I'm excited about this too, because I think we talk often about Yeshua being our high priest, but not knowing exactly what that will look like.
Yes, that's right.
Kingdom.
Yes.
All right. So, hey, take it away if you want to
Thank
summarize a little bit from last time. And
yes, probably the key phrase from last time, the takeaway is that righteousness and justice are the foundation of his throne. That to me, that phrase encapsulates so much about the Messiah, who he is, what his true character is, how he will rule, and what rule even means. What's righteous rule even all about? Why do we anticipate his rule so much? And it's really the answer to the problems that we face even right now today. I mean, the crisis of the world, people talk about global warming and all these other issues, right? That face the world right now, but the fundamental crisis facing the world outside of just the problem of individual human hearts, that we don't yield ourselves to God. The next thing on the list, which is related to this, is the failure of human governance. Anywhere you look, governments fail, and they're failing at a greater and greater rate. Even some governments like our own and others in Western civilization and also other parts of the world that at one time had reasonably good governance, they're beginning to fail. They're moving away from the, if you will, the sacred principles that enabled them to govern as effectively as they did. And
well,
so
it is kind of trippy that world civilizations only exist for a time. And even though we've got a really good constitution, it does seem like it couldn't last forever. And, random factoid, in the 70s, I think it was, MIT conducted a study or did some type of framework modeling.
Oh, yes.
And it's just kind of re-hitting the YouTube airwaves. They predict the end of Western civilization in 2040. By their modeling.
By their modeling.
Yeah. By their modeling.
Yeah.
I don't know what goes into their modeling.
That's very interesting for a lot of other reasons, which I won't get into.
Yeah,
today,
I know. Well, the reason I bring it up is, I think that people will hear songs about meeting Jesus for the first time. They've died, or he's returned, or what will you do? Well, obviously we will all fall, probably fall right down and get our nose as close as to the ground as possible. But we don't think a lot about what Yeshua is going to do.
Yes.
Correct. And this is that's a power for me of this Melchizedek series. And we're getting a bigger picture of what this millennial kingdom and past that will look like.
Yes, that's correct. And we're only scratching the surface too. There would be so much to talk about, but I think for an introductory series, which is what this was intended to be, though it is rather full because the subject is full as you're beginning to understand just how full the subject is. Now we can begin, you have a good starting point, a reference point from which to launch from and develop your understanding much richer and fuller. That's probably the purpose of my book that I trust will come out of, it's the Lord's will, within the next year or so, will be to develop these things in more detail. So you'll find a lot more detail in that book. And the thread of the argument will be more fully developed as well. Something we just can't really do so effectively, even on a podcast of this length. But so pray for that. I'm hoping that when the book does come available, it will inspire and enrich people and hopefully give them a perspective that they've never thought of before.
Well, we look forward to when it comes out, and Maybe give them a precursor somehow.
Yeah,
Our listeners
yeah,
before it comes out. Who knows?
yeah, yeah.
But, man,
Yeah.
awesome.
So yeah, in fact, one of the things about the priesthood you mentioned, and we've been talking about his kingly aspects, which involve largely his rule and his governance. It's almost hard to know at times where the one ends and the other begins. They're so intertwined. So in a sense, I have to do a little parsing, if you will, of this to, in a sense, kind of bring out certain emphasis to make the distinction between his priestly function and his kingly function.
Right.
Yeah, and so you'll see that sometimes we come back to the same passages, and part of that is that we've already read, but what we're going to do is we'll take a different slant on them.
Okay.
In some cases, some of them are new, but there are definitely some passages that we keep returning to because and what I like about those is the fact that you see the integration of the kingly and priestly activities of Messiah within the same passages, within the
Right.
same context. So it's good for people, I think, to see that. And so one of them that we've referred to before, I think that I will begin with because it sets a pretty good tale, or tale is not really the right word, but it sets up the narrative
Mm-hmm.
really well. Because we're going to see that the emphasis here in this section is the fact that when Messiah comes, he's going to teach the people as well as rule them, and teaching is a priestly function, actually. He's going to reveal himself through his rule, and he's going to reveal himself through as a teacher to the peoples about the whys and wherefores of what he is doing. He's going to try to help the people to understand that his rule is conducted in a certain manner for a certain purpose, and the nations of the world need to get on board with that. They need to understand that. So that's the thing we're going to highlight first, and then later when we get to the fourth area, when we talk about the important role Israel will play in this, we will really get down to the thing that will transition us ultimately to the New Testament as well. There's a direct connection between the fourth point that we'll talk about and how this subject gets further developed in the New Testament, particularly in the book of Hebrews. So that's kind of where we're going.
So, when Jeremiah is talking new covenant language in Jeremiah 31:34, it says, they will not teach again each man his neighbor and
Yes.
each man his brother, um, saying, know the Lord, for they will all know me. Now,
Yeah.
I think there's a heavy emphasis there on whose name is written in the book of life. But it also seems that there's a teaching part here. Is this potentially a reference to the priestly role that Yeshua will have? Are we not doing the teaching, but Yeshua is doing the teaching, or is it some kind of it's already written on our hearts all the way?
Oh, that's a very interesting question, actually, and one we'll probably more fully develop when we get to the New Testament. But let
Okay.
me just mention here that yes, as glorified saints, one of our roles is to actually be under His direction to teach the nations. That will be, I believe, part of our job. That seems to be insinuated very strongly in the text.
Wow.
Yeah. So this is a significant thing, isn't it? Oh, you mean believers today are going to be teaching the Torah to the peoples? I mean, I
Yeah.
want you to think about that and think of the implications that has. So yes, it will be. We will be functioning with him, as will the people of Israel, because they will be sort of the model. I mean, they will be established, as we're going to see, as the model for the world. That was,
Okay.
in fact, their original commission.
I know enough of my theology to know that there are a few eyebrows that just went up into the last phrases. So I'll just cool my jets. I'm going to listen to the argument.
Okay.
All right, I'm ready.
Well, so I'd like to start off with this and read fully, because I don't believe we've done that yet. Isaiah 56.
Okay.
It's a very remarkable passage, and it's both a passage that was kind of a call out to the people of Isaiah's time, but it's quite clear that it was also intended to be a prophetic passage, something that's pointing us forward to the future. That becomes more obvious as you get toward the end of the chapter.
Mm-hmm.
But So I'll just go through the first, I think it's 8 verses, first
Okay.
8 verses. So it says in Isaiah 56, thus says the Lord, keep justice and do righteousness. Well, there we are. So that's the first clue, that we're talking about today, but we're also talking probably about the future as well.
Right. I see it.
For my salvation is about to come. And the salvation here being discussed, most likely, I mean, obviously it includes the personal salvation that most believers are familiar with, but it certainly goes beyond that. And often the term salvation in the Old Testament scriptures was often referencing the salvation of a people's, salvation of the world in a broadest sense, you might say, where the world now and the people of Israel specifically come into a period of peace, tranquility, safety, blessing. It's the blessings and cursings, but not, now here we're finally getting to the blessing part. Where a faithful people are being blessed and enriched by the Messiah and by the Lord because of their obedience. So my salvation is about to come, and my righteousness to be revealed. Blessed is the man who does this, and the Son of Man who lays hold on it. The Son of Man here is not the Son of Man, but it's talking about people in this context. And the Son of Man who will hold on to these principles. And here's the interesting part that I think should not get lost here. It follows this with, and who keeps from defiling the Sabbath. Now, I think this is very interesting that the Sabbath, and in fact, the Sabbath is highlighted several times here in this chapter, because when you think about the Sabbath is a picture of the entire Messianic age, and that becomes very clear. I think most people, in fact, who've studied this subject, come to that conclusion that it's kind of the picture of the Messianic age. Why is that? Because the Sabbath really is rooted in the concept of shalom, of peace.
Right, yeah.
And in fact, that's why it was commanded to be observed, because God wanted people to have one day a week where they rest in Him and in the peace that comes by resting in Him to us. Because this concept is a very profound, if you understand it properly, motivator for our lives. It can be a tremendous motivation to us if we can just hold on to that and grasp it. So the Sabbath is highlighted here, and I think it's one of the things in this chapter that really forces you to link it with the kingdom to come. That the Sabbath, the kingdom. Of course, there are other places this is discussed as well, but this one in particular, I think, is poignant in that regard.
Yeah.
So who keeps from defiling the Sabbath, keeps his hand from doing any evil. Do not let the son of the foreigner. Okay, now this is important because now we're branching outside of Israel. And we could ask ourselves, well, is this Sabbath, is this shalom, is this peace that God has, is this only for Israel? And we're going to say, no, it is not. It has never been always for Israel. And one of the great tragedies of Israelite history is they had a hard time getting that out of their minds. They began to think of this as, this is something special between us and God,
Right.
And they did not share it to the world in the way that God had intended. Now, this has always been God's heart for the entire world. So he says, do not let the son of the foreigner who has joined himself to the Lord speak, saying, the Lord has utterly separated me from his people. Now, isn't that interesting? In other words, he's saying basically, no, don't you think, you Gentiles, that you are utterly separated from Israel. You're not. You can be a part of this experience, of this, if you will, experiment. You can be an integral part of it.
So this, and we've covered this with Jacob in that podcast, that Yahweh makes a way for any stranger sojourner to be totally grafted in to the Commonwealth of Israel.
Yes, that's
awesome.
right.
Okay, so we're looking at a passage.
And by the way, that's both Old and New Testament.
Oh, certainly.
Both, agree, right? Both Old and New Testament.
So we have plenty of these passages that are highlighting that, and we can expect that in the future this could happen too. All right. So I think most evangelicals are like, great. I mean, hopefully that's the case. We're kind of banking on it. Okay, so great. We got that down. Well, how do we know when it talks about not profaning the Sabbath any longer? It's like, I don't want to, first of all, we can't cherry pick,
Mhm.
both should happen. How do we know this is set sometime in the future? Isaiah 56
Mhm.
set sometime in the future, and that somehow we're referring to the weekly. Are we referring to the weekly Shabbat here? Or are we?
Clearly,
Yeah,
clearly,
I
yeah,
think so too.
yeah, yeah. Mhm.
But how do we know that? How do we know that Isaiah 56 is set sometime in the future? That somehow Yahweh is going to make sure that his seventh day Sabbath is not desecrated. How do we know it's in the future?
Yeah, in terms of the Old Testament, it's pretty clear because they had no other concept for the word. I mean, you can just do a lexical study of the word Sabbath, and you'll see it is never used in the Old Testament to refer to anything other than the seventh day of the week,
No,
or by extension to the annual Sabbaths.
no, my question is for our listener.
Mhm.
How do we know that Isaiah 56 is set sometime in the future?
Oh, well, that is going to come as we get to the bottom here.
Okay, I know I'm
Although,
probably always
yeah,
thinking ahead.
the illusions are there already, but we'll see that
Okay.
it does connect. So we'll go on then. I think we're now at the eunuch. Yes, I wanted to draw out this portion as well. Nor let the eunuch say, "Here I am, a dry tree." The eunuch, of course, was a male who was castrated to be in service generally of a king over a harem. And so the eunuch could not have reproduced. The one thing about a eunuch is that they would have been unable to father children because of this procedure that was enacted upon them against, by the way, against their will. They didn't volunteer for this service as a general rule. So, so here they are. They're kind of victims of circumstance, and for them, progeny was very important in the ancient world, and they realized that well, they're a dry tree. They're a tree that's going to wither and die. They're not going to be able to perpetuate their line because of this. Thus says the Lord to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, and now it's put in the plural. And I think that's fascinating. And choose what pleases me, and hold fast my covenant. Even to them I will give in my house and within my walls a place and a name. So notice how he answers the eunuch. The eunuch is saying, I have no place, I have no name, because I cannot perpetuate my name through my
Mm-hmm.
offspring. But God is saying, no, you have a name and you have a place. Better than that of sons of daughters. There we are. So it's directly addressing the eunuch, and I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. Also the sons of the foreigner who join themselves to the Lord. Now listen to this verse, and I think it's really important for people when they're reading this. There is both a message to the present for us, and there's a message to the future, as we're going to see. Who join themselves to the Lord to serve him and to love the name of the Lord, to be his servants. This is the message. And then he says again, everyone who keeps from defiling the Sabbath. There's something about that. In other words, there's something about honoring this that instills within the hearts and minds of a person a whole different mindset, a whole different attitude. This is what I believe Isaiah is driving at. And thereby holds fast my covenant. As we know in Exodus 31, the Sabbath was given as a special sign of the covenant. So you see here, I think Isaiah is making some reference back to that, saying, look, remember how when God established the covenant, he said, now, there's one commandment here that I've just given you that's the sign. It's,
Mm-hmm.
and a sign was a very important thing in the ancient world. I mean, that was a big deal. He's highlighting it, and Isaiah in Exodus 31, and Isaiah is returning to that same idea here in chapter 56, that there's something special about this, that if you do this, you will really be showing forth the heart of the servant. You'll be identifying yourself as his servant. And then verse 7, and we now get kind of closer to the prophetic angle of this. Even them I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. their burnt offerings and sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations. Now, we know that that was fulfilled when Solomon established and dedicated the original temple. In fact, he makes reference to this will be a house of prayer for all nations. But the reality is, and this is where we connect it, the reality is that that never really happened. It certainly did not happen anywhere near the fullness of what Isaiah is describing here. And in, by the way, some other passages that will follow shortly after in chapters 57, 58, and so forth as we go on. So in the context here, what we're seeing is there was this call, and this call of Isaiah is reminding, in a sense, Israel of their original obligation. Before God even spoke out the Ten Commandments from Mount Sinai, he gave them a commission, and we'll come back and talk about that commission a little bit later in full. But he gave them a commission which was to reach out to the peoples of the world with this, and to allow any who were willing to join with them in this endeavor. That's sort of the essence of this. And we can see that here. And Israel failed in this obligation. They did not really do this. And so here, Isaiah is showing us that, no, this will continue on, and it will be, and we will see it verified. Okay, so in a sense, we see the fact that it did not become fulfilled, because the language here, by the way, is talking in a context of this is going to happen, but it didn't happen. So in other words, God is declaring this through the prophet, that this is something that's going to happen, but it didn't happen in Isaiah's time. It didn't happen in really all throughout Israel's time, and including the Second Temple period, right up to the fall of the temple. Although I will say in the first century, it probably happened more than it happened in any other period of history. There was more of an effort made to reach out to the peoples of the world in the first century. That in itself is, by the way, a very interesting topic that we should come back to at some other podcast. But it still fell short. It fell very short, because unfortunately Judaism itself, by that point, had become corrupted. And so what happens is, if you take a historical view and you realize, well, the prophet is saying this is going to happen. Remember, it said at the beginning, my salvation that is about to come. In other words, it is pointing us forward a little bit. But it never came, except through the person of Yeshua. He did come, but even he did not complete the mission, and that was intentional. Remember, he read the first part of Isaiah 61, and then closed the book, and the second part of Isaiah 61 was not read.
And then in what way, Gary, did he not complete the mission?
Yeah, he didn't come as king. He didn't set up the kingdom.
Okay, there we go.
Because that's the key thing to understanding the fullness of this entire prophecy. That kingdom has to be on the earth.
Right, okay.
On the earth, with the direct rule of Messiah over the nations.
Yeah,
and
so
as we
again,
talked
it's
about
not that he could not have.
No, it's not that he could not have. It's all in timing. It's all in timing.
God's perfect process
Correct.
To unfold. Okay.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah. So that's what we learn, and this passage is showing us that the sons of the foreigner and the eunuch, and these individuals who would have been, by even Israel's estimation, in too many cases, sort of removed or cut off from the covenant. God is saying, oh, no. The covenant with me is a part of what transpires in the hearts of individual people. If they're Gentiles and they have a heart to serve me, they are more than welcome to enter in and stand with you Israelites in the house of prayer. You see?
Okay.
So that's kind of the central message of this. And of course, the Sabbath comes in and is brought in an interesting fashion. And it really does show, when you understand how people view the Sabbath, that mention's not unintentional. It's intentional. It's meant to draw us to the ultimate fulfillment of these words, that, in the day of the Sabbath, that eschatological day of the Sabbath, which is the millennial kingdom, that's when you'll see this fully fulfilled. That's kind of the idea, I think, that Isaiah is getting to here. So, and I might add that being in the process fulfilled, I also think of, like Colossians 2:17, Paul, I think, had this understanding when he said, he said of you eat and you drink and you observe new moons and Sabbaths in the plural, and he says later in a sort of explanatory clause, probably referencing the Sabbaths, perhaps the new moons, as a shadow of things to come, is how it's rendered in most versions, or a shadow of things coming. And I find that interesting because then Paul, and by the way, the tense is clear. It's a future oriented kind of tense. It's in the infinitive or the, some equivalent tense to that. I don't remember the exact tense there because often it's rendered to come in a number of translations, but probably coming is closer to it. But both convey the same idea, right? In other words, we're anticipating it.
Right, yeah.
It's something we anticipate. So they're a shadow of things that we're anticipating. So there we are. Paul is telling us right there in Colossians, from his perspective in the first century, hey guys, this hasn't happened yet. These things are still unfulfilled. They remain unfulfilled. Yes.
Oh, and I know how that verse gets all botched up.
It does get botched up. It's terrible. It's awful.
Well, back in the day, that's one of the verses I think Jacob
Yeah.
he used to fight me on. Jacob, neener. That's right.
Yes. Yeah. So for Paul, who lived, of course, right almost up to the very end of the temple period, was telling us, no, this has not yet been fulfilled. Mm-hmm. And so that again is another bit of evidence that we should be looking to the future. All right, so then on to Malachi 3. I'd like to talk about that because this begins now to address a foundational principle for Messiah as high priest. See, only the high priest purifies the priests, right? In the old Levitical system. Yeah, okay. Mm-hmm. We see this here. So we see the Messiah is going to be serving in that role. He's going to purify the priesthood. So Malachi 3, verses 1 to 4, says the following, and this will be familiar. This entire section, in fact, is a whole segment of Handel's Messiah. So this is interesting. So I like to refer back to that, particularly given the time of year we're in, where Messiah is sung often during this holiday season. The people listen to the words. Listen to the words. Handel did a brilliant job in assembling this libretto, if you will, for his cantata.
Well, people have just made it another cultural ditty.
Cultural ditty, yeah.
And we go out and drink our cocoa and call it good.
Call it good, yeah.
And
that's right. Yeah.
There's more going on there.
More going on there than you realize. And he says, behold, I can almost sing this, but I'll spare you.
Oh, come on.
I used to be, very interested in choral and things like that. So I know actually the music quite well. But behold, I send my messenger, and he will prepare the way before me. And the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple. Now that's in the person of Messiah, as we know. Even the messenger of the covenant. See, the wording here is fascinating, and I won't get off on it. I could, but if I do, it's going to take us far afield, but certainly important. But the messenger of the covenant is being referenced here. So we're going to see Messiah is the messenger of the covenant. And the word messenger, by the way, in the Hebrew is virtually identical to the word angel. So this brings confusion sometimes. You could say the angel of the covenant, and probably that would translate this just as well. But it's talking about the messenger, the one who brings, who is the one who makes it happen. Makes it happen.
Right.
In whom you delight. Behold, he is coming, says the Lord of hosts. But who can endure the day of his coming? Ah, yes. Now we see that this actually is a double entendre. There's a sense in which who can endure it in his first coming, and who is going to endure it in his second coming. In other words, it really, I think, has a pointed application to both the time when Yeshua appeared, and he did come to his temple, didn't he? And he did confront the priesthood in his temple. But the job was not completed. It was introduced. And then there's a gap. And now, in his second coming, that job will be completed. Who can endure the day of his coming, and who can stand when he appears? For he is like a refiner's fire, like a launderer's soap. He will sit as a refiner and a purifier of silver. He will purify, and this is the important part, the sons of Levi. Only one holier, if you will, than the Levites can purify the Levites.
Yeah.
And purge them as gold and silver, that they may offer to the Lord an offering in righteousness. And then it says, then the offering of Judah and Jerusalem will be pleasant to the Lord, as in the days of old, as in the former years. And that did not happen. It's an historical fact, really, that this did not happen, even by the end of the first century, when the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D. In fact, what we know, historians know about this period, is that the priesthood, after the Romans came in, became completely corrupted. It was actually the kernel of the issue that was a constant source of confrontation between Yeshua and the Pharisees and Sadducees, was this corruption that had happened among the religious leadership of Judaism. And again, we could explore this more fully in another session, but even the archaeological evidence, of which there's been an extensive amount of it uncovered now in the last 30 years, in Judea, in the Galilee, up in Syria, parts of Asia Minor, has really given more insight about what the true nature of the controversies were between Yeshua and the Pharisees. And it's something that is not understood or appreciated, certainly by most pastors and even by relatively few scholars. But the information is so evident in the record, you can't deny it. And so this would be a very interesting topic for us to come back to at another occasion. But I bring it up because it's showing that the end state, not only did it not arrive at the state that God had intended, but it had devolved. It was on the way down. It was on the way out because of the corruption that had come into the priesthood at that time. So Yeshua's timing in his appearance was very auspicious, I think, because he was coming at a time when this decline in the priesthood and the religious leadership of Judaism was probably really almost at its apex, and just sort of the last gasp before it was going to finally make that descent into oblivion. So the purification of the sons of Levi then is telling us this. It's telling us that whoever this Messiah is, he must stand in the priestly role. And indeed, he must be ultimately acting at least as a high priest, because only the high priest could bring the priests into purification. Yeah. So that's the key element of this. And I wanted to go to Malachi because,
Okay.
by the way, Malachi is one of the last prophecies that we have from the Old Testament. So this is what, at the end of the canon of the Old Testament, people were looking forward to. They were anticipating, was this ultimate repurification, if you will, of the Levitical system. And now we go on to Isaiah chapter 2, and we've again touched upon this verse before, but we're going to look at it again from a slightly different perspective and an emphasis which will become evident in my reading, I trust. So we will begin, I think it's with verse 2 or 3. I'm trying to remember. I'll just start with 3. We read verse 2 earlier. And it says the following, Isaiah 2, verse 3, and it'll just be a couple verses here. Many people shall come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, and we shall walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. And then here it gives the time context. He shall judge between the nations and rebuke many peoples. So I just read verses 3 and 4 there.
Mm-hmm.
And so here we have a direct connection. When you see phraseology like that, and of course, if you go on to read in chapter 2, it's clearly a future context, is what we're talking about. It's talking about the Messiah, as the first two verses makes clear, and we read that earlier in an earlier session. And so it's the Messiah reigning from Jerusalem. And from there, he is teaching the nation. So he's not just ruling, he's teaching.
Yeah, it's interesting too for me in verse 3, it phrases it, and that they may walk in his paths. Which sounds like David in Psalm 23.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Clearly connects it to the law, for the law will go forth from Zion.
Yes.
Yeah, so it's just for me, a lot of people read Psalm 23 innocently and read the paths and not really
understand what that means.
They just think that, God is guiding you step by step. And that may be true, but it seems to me that David is implicitly, maybe explicitly, talking about the Torah.
Yes, that's right. And in fact, even the idea that when Jewish people and the Old Testament talk about walking, for instance, walk is halach in the Hebrew, right? And it's and the halakha is the laws and the principles of God. So even the word walk in the Hebrew, walk in what? Well, you walk in a path, don't you? You're walking somewhere and you're going a direction. That idea always conveyed. It was almost idiomatic, but it became more than an idiom later in Judaism. But it was idiomatic, I think, in the Old Testament, of walking in the ways of God as He prescribed through His commandments and His Torah.
Okay, got it. All right, so here we are. Looks like Isaiah 2. You've read.
Yes, I just read
3.
2. Yes,
part of verse 4 there. All right.
So just to establish that, yes, there's a teaching aspect to the rule, and of course the priests. I put the emphasis on teaching here because one of the major jobs of a priest in ancient Israel was to teach. They were to teach the people the law. Most people don't realize that, but priests served as kind of, we think, magistrates in their areas, wherever they were living. And usually, of course, there were cities dedicated to the priests to live in, and there they would study the Word of God, and they would then be able to go out and instruct the people in the Word of God. That was kind of their mission when they were not at the temple. That's what they were doing. And so when they were at the temple, of course, they had specific duties, right, that they would have to do that were of a sort of ritual nature. And they would only do that about 4 weeks of the year, to be at the temple. They had courses. David had organized them into courses. And there were 24 courses which showed up for 1 week at a time, and they would do that twice a year. You can see sort of 24 times 2 is 48, so that's almost a full year. And then those other 4 weeks, the entire priesthood would come. And those times are surrounding the festivals season, when the entire priesthood would be on call, because, of course, the entire nation would be called up to worship the Lord at the temple in Jerusalem. So it's good to have that framework in the back of our minds to understand that, it was only like arguably maybe 1/12 of the year the priests were doing their priestly ministration that we usually think of, which is, slaughtering animals and all the other duties attendant with that. But the other 11/12 of the year, they were ministering to the people in their local areas where they lived and teaching them the law.
Oh, so they didn't have a bunch of downtime.
No, they didn't. They didn't. Yes, that's right.
Yeah,
and they would consult.
They weren't the school teachers of their time that had that whole summer off.
No, they didn't. I trust they got some rest. Well, they got rest on the Shabbat, I presume, but and other times as well. But they had kind of, and the priests themselves, in some sense, I don't know how much of a magisterial duties they carried. In some cases, they may have had to do that, but because we know that there were other magistrates that would largely take care of what we would call civil matters, it seems. But certainly when it came to anything that involved the, if you want to call it the cultic area of Israelite law, cultic in this sense meaning related to worship, related to those kinds of issues, the priests were at the forefront. They would interpret and decide how these things were to be understood. Right. So it's fascinating to think of that when you and it helps us, I think, to better understand, how it is that Messiah could be high priest and he's involved in a teaching ministry. Most people might think, well, that just means he's doing rituals.
Right.
No. In fact, the bulk of the duty of the high priest was not rituals. There were special times in the year, and we'll talk further about this when we get to Ezekiel's temple. That the high priest was very involved in the ritual aspects. He was the centerpiece for it, But in fact, he was a teacher of the priesthood. And the priests then were a teacher of the people. And that's kind of, in a general sense, how it worked. So we would learn, and here there are so many numerous passages, but this law go forth out of Zion, and often you'll hear another phrase, which I think I read last time actually from one of the passages. It will go forth to the isles, and expressions of this nature. The isles was an idiomatic expression to refer to the nations, to the Gentile nations, to the peoples who lived afar off. That was. And you and your members of your audience can just do a simple word search, and start looking to see where these kinds of phrases appear, and they might be shocked as to how numerous they are, this kind of thing. So
yeah,
it's good for people to do this. I think to help themselves realize that what we're talking about here is not just, even though I'm forced to go to just relatively few passages. This message is not just in a few places. It is everywhere in the prophets. And if you made a point to just say, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to note every place this appears. Just write it down. I guarantee you'll be writing a while. You'll be writing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of verses and passages that talk about this in the prophets. And, just the sheer volume of this should cause a person to sit back and think, this was all done away with? God threw it all in the trash can and developed a new plan? Really? Especially when he speaks of it as, this will happen, this will happen. The tense in the Hebrew often very clear. No, this is definite. This is going to happen. There's in the language of the Hebrew, there's very little wiggle room.
Yeah, I think for people, let's just say they just fully disagreed with you and me on this topic. They might say something like, well, yeah, it could be in the future tense, but because Jesus has not come yet, it's all talking about Jesus. But I think it's just clear in the context that there is a past first coming sense, and it's about second coming. It's about something we are still looking forward to.
Yes, certainly to, I think, a Christian audience, that should be abundantly clear. Now, a Jewish audience, I understand, because they don't believe he came the first time, so that's a different issue, right?
Yeah.
But to those who know he has come and are carefully reading these passages, you have to do a lot of denial. You really have to do flat-out denial to miss this in its clearest intended sense. And, of course, as we're going to see in the New Testament, the apostles themselves reaffirm these things. They reaffirm the covenant. And so now we're left without excuse, because the apostles were designated to communicate and teach the people, like priests.
Right.
What was going to happen in the future. And John's Revelation, look at John's book of Revelation. It's saturated with temple imagery. Saturated. It's all over the place in John. And John is drawing us back to a lot of these same concepts and ideas to explain what's going to take place in the future. So this will come to pass. In fact, as we're going to see, God says repeatedly, my name and my reputation depend on this. His name depends on it. That's big. And God says, my name depends on this occurring. That's huge. I believe you have to almost get to the point of worshiping another God to deny this. You have to almost be worshiping another God to deny this. That's how strong the language is. And all we have is language, right? What do we got? We have nothing but language
Yeah.
in the history. And what is it saying? What is it telling us? And where do we get off thinking we can interpret it differently than the clear intention of the text?
Yeah.
Yeah. So,
Yeah. Get it.
so this Torah, God will bring to the peoples, and it will take time. By the way, I don't think it'll be in an instant. It's not going to happen instantly, but I think it'll happen in a fairly short order. People, when they see certain things happening, they're going to get with the program pretty rapidly. Most of them, and they're going to be more than willing. In fact, I think at the end of this period of history we're coming into, which is going to be is described by Yeshua himself as in the days of Noah. I mean, he puts it in those terms. This is going to be a true shaking of heaven and earth. It's going to be almost anything we see around us now. Hardly any of it may be standing. And it's going to be I think a psychological shift for people that they're going to have to kind of process and go through. I think many peoples of the world are going to be very eager to know what the Messiah wants us to do and to step right in. There'll be a few rebels, but I think most people are going to understand that, wow, look what we did. As a human species, we drove ourselves to the brink of annihilation. And in fact, if God hadn't intervened, we're told in the New Testament in the Olivet prophecy, that's exactly what we would have done. We would have destroyed each other.
Mm-hmm.
So it's I think that sense is going to be there. So we're going to see people, as a whole, I think being very desirous of coming into harmony with the Messiah's plan for their lives. And in fact, if anything, the most trouble the Messiah is going to have is with the leadership of people. Interestingly enough, that's highlighted, by the way, and we've talked a little bit about that before, that some of the leaders he's going to have to deal with a little more forcefully. So, the primary purpose for the Messianic kingdom, in my estimation, and this is more like I'm sharing with you now kind of a conclusion, just from my own summary of the data and the things that I've thought about over the years as I've studied this subject, is to reclaim the earth. This is a reclamation project. He had plans for the earth and they were interrupted. And God will do that because he has another purpose in mind for allowing such things and for then saying, okay, you want to go your own way, I'll step back. I'll step back. I'll let you go your own way. And we'll see how that works out for you. And
Good.
Not good. No. And it hasn't been good. And he's had to intervene a few times in history. And his sort of what I like to term manifest intervention is actually relatively rare. This is an intervention that's not just the little quiet, subtle interventions, which he does on a daily basis with people's lives, in people's circumstances, in the miracles that have been performed that some people have witnessed. That's one element of his intervention, right? And that is something that occurs on a somewhat regular basis. But the manifest revelation where a good part of the world becomes aware of it, those are rare instances in human history. And so he stands back. He just says, okay, you go your way, and let's see how this works out. And we have made a mess of it. And so now we're coming up to the culmination of human history where I think many people feel, we're at definitely a break point here. We're at a crossroads. There's one road here, there's another road over here. And we know humanity as a whole is going to take the bad road going forward.
Yeah.
And when that happens, then there's going to be set in motion factors of such a nature that it would actually require God's manifest intervention and to come back, to intervene, and to set things right again, to reclaim the earth, to restore the earth. That's really, it's fascinating, and it apparently this must even precede the coming of the New Jerusalem. This is important. It's an important phase, an important development that must transpire. So, this is the plan, and in this plan, of course, of reclamation is God's outreach, particularly to all the nations of the earth. Now it's not just about calling out his people. He will do that, and he will renew them. That'll be the subject of our next point. But he wants all of humanity to get the lesson, to understand the lesson of what has transpired. He set a plan in action. He had it in mind really from the beginning. Nothing fooled him. He wasn't surprised by the Garden of Eden. He wasn't surprised by even the Noachian deluge, right? According to the scripture. He understood this. But he has a whole narrative that's unfolding in human history so that human beings will look back on it and say, I get it. I understand. I understand what happened and why it happened. And it's a lesson that goes deep into the souls of people. And this is going to be something that we're going to see in the next point and also in the Ezekiel's temple. This is why God's doing what he's doing. It's all part of the Reclamation Project. It's all part of the restoring of the earth, restoring human beings, restoring human hearts, restoring institutions, restoring the earth itself. The earth itself will need to be healed and refreshed and brought back into how it had been originally created. So everything is going to be put back into harmony. That's really the goal of the Messianic age, of the millennial reign. So we find that in Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6, and I'll just briefly refer to this because I think it's a really huge idea that is going to, in a certain sense, set the stage for what happens in the New Testament. And we'll come back to it, certainly, and show how this idea is developed. But I think it's very important as a way of transitioning to our fourth point that we need to understand. So in verse 5 of Exodus 19, now the setting of this is that God is about to give the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai. He's going to actually appear to them, or at least he's going to appear to them in fire, and he's going to speak his voice. They're going to hear the voice of God. I mean, this is when those commandments come forth. But what is a sort of preamble to this? Much like, our Constitution has a preamble. It says, why do we have this Constitution?
Right.
And the first paragraph of the Constitution tells you this is why. This is what we hope to accomplish with this Constitution. That's the preamble. These verses are the preamble to the entire giving of the Torah to the people of Israel.
Yeah.
So they have a great importance, and these are verses referred to in the New Testament in description of our commission as believers. So it says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine. I find that fascinating right there. So right away he's saying you'll be special, but keep in mind all of the earth is mine. So this preamble is telling Israel, if you want to be my special people, I'm developing a covenant with you, and if you want to really be special to me, you fulfill this covenant. This is my heart, is to see all of the world ultimately be brought under the rubric of service and obedience to the God of heaven, and as we know, through the Messiah when he appears. And then it says to Israel specifically, very pointedly, in verse 6, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests, and a holy nation. A nation set apart, an entire people group set apart. And people have talked about this verse a lot, like, well, was God's intention the Levitical priesthood or a kingdom of priests? And I say, well, actually both, in a sense, although it's hard to know. Sometimes you get into this almost sort of conundrum of philosophical arguments where you say, well, what did God know, and this kind of thing. And so
Yeah.
we know that the Levitical priest did come forth, and we know the circumstances under which it was established. But again, God knows the end from the beginning, so it's
Yeah. Sometimes I listen to Foreman, and he'll use when he refers to some things, and in this instance, the Levitical priesthood as a plan B. And
yes,
I just
yeah,
kind of,
yeah.
I don't like that.
Yeah, I know, and it is a conundrum because we, from our reference point, because we're very temporal creatures, and unlike God, who I believe stands kind of outside of space and time, he has the ability
Yeah.
to be in something we call eternity. It's a different experience for him than for us. For us, it feels like Plan B because we see it coming in a certain chronological order, right? And this
Right.
kind of thing. But with God, it's very different, and I don't understand it. How can I? I mean, we're locked into space and time, and even as a physicist, who, by the way, I know a lot about these matters. It's part of my research endeavors and things of this nature. So I believe I understand it pretty well. We cannot comprehend what it means to be outside of space and time. I mean, how can we? It's beyond our experience to really do this. We can muse about it, we can speculate about it, but I don't think there's anyone on the planet that has true understanding about that. So it's we can understand what we can understand, and I think we can understand space time very well.
Mm-hmm.
but outside of it, I don't know.
Yeah.
I take a very agnostic, if you will.
Here I know my place.
So yeah, and that's the dilemma as you're reading through this. But let me read. I'll start verse 6 again because I don't want to break that actually.
Yeah.
And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. So God is actually telling Moses to translate these or transfer these words to the people as his messenger in that place at that time. And so the people are getting this preamble that, wow, God is doing something truly special with us. And you can see the heart of God in this, that he isn't saying, well, I'm your king, and by golly, you're going to bow the knee to me. He didn't introduce the Torah with that kind of attitude or those kinds of words. He says, if you will covenant with me and you will do this, you will be special to me, and you will be a kingdom of priests, and you will be a holy people. And as the Torah develops, he adds to this. He talks about the blessings that they would have if they were to keep this and fulfill their covenant obligation. And for the Israelites, this was a covenant obligation.
Mm-hmm.
You make a covenant with God and you say, we will do this. You know what? That covenant doesn't just end with you, but it goes generation to generation to generation to generation.
Yeah.
So they were speaking for all of their progeny that they would have, you see. This is how the Torah and the rest of the Old Testament presents this idea. So this is how it's introduced. And I think this is of great significance because we're going to see then that we know, of course, that Israel failed, and they failed miserably. They had moments where they did well. And you can look at Israelite history and later Jewish history up until the fall of the temple in 70 A.D., and you can see within that span of history what I like to call sort of points of brilliant light scattered throughout the history where they were really starting to come into this and starting to really do this. They had righteous kings, and they had other leaders who were righteous, who led the people appropriately, and they started to really rise up and do this thing, but they could never sustain it. And it just seemed like there was this tremendous pulling them down back into their carnality, and their feelings of being, well, we're a special people. They got that part of it. But they didn't understand that being a special people carries with it certain obligations.
Yeah.
And I think there's a parallel with us as believers that we're going to explore when we get to the New Testament that is the reason why the apostles refer to these kinds of verses and say, hey guys, these apply to us too, maybe in a somewhat different way, but they apply. And if that's the case, the message is, if we today are going to be a special people, if we are going to be his special treasure, a holy, set apart people. Ah, we've made a covenant. We have obligations. You know, they are obligations that you have in a covenantal, loving relationship, just like a husband to a wife, right? Husband and wife,
Hmm.
they have covenantal obligations to one another. and you can't ignore that. You
So
can't
then,
ignore
Gary,
that.
do I have a covenantal obligation in relation to the new covenant? Because is that not
Hmm.
unilateral?
Hmm.
Okay, then how? What is my covenantal obligation as part of the new covenant?
Well, one thing, of course, we recognize the basis of our salvation comes through the atoning blood of Messiah. That's very critical, and that's why when Yeshua, just before he dies, what does he do? He sets up a covenant through the bread and the wine. Another, by the way, Melchizedekian endeavor, as we learned earlier in Genesis
Right,
13, is a
right.
completely parallel to that. And he's what he's saying is it. You have to begin with me. You have to start with me. You have to know me. You have to love me. You have to be wanting to serve me. Okay. Now that's an obligation, isn't it? I mean, that's clearly what
Sure.
he's talking about there.
Yeah.
He's calling us into service. So it begins there. And then there are things that he instructed. I mean, he did maybe 3.5 years, probably no more than that, of teaching in his public ministry. What did he teach about? What did he talk about? He talked about the Torah and all of its different manifestations and relationships to people and principles that he wanted people to embrace as a way of life, right? So there's a way of life obligation that's implicit in this covenantal relationship because why spend 3.5 years teaching his disciples with the
Yeah.
clear intention that they would carry on his teaching, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Just say that. Yeah.
yeah. See,
Teach them to observe
to
all I've
observe all things
commanded
I've
you.
commanded you. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so this is all part of those sets of obligations. In fact, the parallels are striking between the New and Old Testament in this regard. It's really very much the same way. It's set in a different setting. It's set in a slightly different context, but the method, the basic principles, the fundamentals certainly of the relationship that we have with Messiah and that Israel would have had with their God, they're all basically, I don't see any change
Yeah,
in those things.
as I'm reflecting here on New Covenant, that though in one sense it is unilateral, and if we sin, if we transgress, he is
Hmm.
faithful and just to forgive us
Correct.
our sin.
Yes.
But it doesn't mean that we lack obligation.
Correct.
Right. So
That's
I
right.
think that's one of
No.
the parts of it is that
Mhm.
this is the part of the new covenant that I don't think is talked enough about.
No.
We
No.
always see it as the punctiliar, the point
Yes.
at which we uh, pass over, cross over, so that we have salvation or assured salvation. Let's put it that
Hmm.
way for now. But there is an obligation that we have to our Messiah.
Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, I don't think we talk about that
No, we
part
don't talk
enough.
about it enough. Just to conclude this point, I would maybe go back to that marriage analogy. You know, husband and wife, we have a marriage ceremony, and everybody they stand before a community of people, right, and they give their vows.
Yeah.
That's yeah, right, and they pledge things to one another. It's a covenant relationship. Okay.
Yeah.
And so, what would somebody think of a person? It could be either spouse, but I'll just say the man. What if the man then after this says, well, I made my vow, I did my little shtick in front of the people and said, now I'm going to go live my life the way I please. And I
Yeah,
don't
that's not cool.
necessarily,
That's
yeah,
not
right.
cool. That's
I
not
don't
cool.
necessarily believe I'm bound to any of my obligations and vows that I just stated, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
mean, think about that. I mean, people would be abhorred by that. So now take that idea and translate it into your relationship with God and His Messiah. Where do we stand? Each person has to answer that for themselves. But
Right.
what are we doing? Did if we didn't make a vow, by the way, maybe we should question: Are we in Messiah? You
Well, I
know?
think everyone would want to know what vows did I commit to?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
We don't have time to talk about that today.
No, we don't.
Talk about that. Gary, is there any other wrap-up comments you have for this Melchizedekian priesthood? Who is this man? Yeshua is a priest in the order of Melchizedek, and he serves as priest and will bring about, he will teach the nations.
Yeah, that's a good summary for today. And now what we'll do is we'll next time transition to the focus on how this will be accomplished, how he will begin with his people Israel, and from there branch out to the nations. Okay. And this is where Ezekiel's temple will also come into play. It's actually part of the fourth point, and yet it can stand alone as a separate point because of its significance. And so I kind of attach it to the end, of point 4, but it can really be developed as a topic all its own for obvious reasons. And what we'll see is at least how the Old Testament prophets saw this being accomplished. And what they present is a powerful thing. It's powerful because when mankind in the Messianic reign is saved, if you will, they are thoroughly, fully saved. Every single person knows who the Messiah is, what he desires of us, and the relationship that he desires to have with us, and they will embrace it.
Okay.
Fully. You see, this is the goal. The Messiah has to demonstrate this. This is a point of demonstration. 1,000 years just to make a point. That's what God is doing. It's going to take 1,000 years just to make a profound point to people that I believe will resonate for all eternity.
All right, we got to wrap it up there for today. Listener, you're hanging in there, and we might not know each other, but I'm proud of you. I mean, this really takes some work to dive into. And, even as Gary is talking, we're going to have to go back and reread these biblical texts and go. And if you haven't read Isaiah all the way through, if you haven't read Ezekiel all the way through, you got to read these all the way through so you have at least some type of groundwork to listen to these sorts of teachings. So anyway, got to remember this. Yeshua said, hey, go make disciples of all nations, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. Our Messiah is Yahweh. We're monotheists. That Torah, Yeshua walked in it every day. He taught his disciples. We want to be like our Messiah. We're going to be disciples and do it ourselves and teach others to do it. And we got to do it every day. And that's why we call it Everyday Torah. We'll see you next time.